So thank you guys so much for joining us this afternoon for the first of our two-part webinar series. This is something we have done the last few years with Tennessee History Day and teaching with primary sources at MTSU. This is a great way to kind of supplement the in-person workshops that we've been doing for a number of years that are very kind of introductory in nature. And then these webinars, we are hoping to kind of dig into a little bit more advanced information than what we have covered in some of our in-person workshops. So I'm Kira Duke. I work with teaching with primary sources at MTSU, and I've got just a couple of preliminary things before I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Stacy Graham, who's going to be taking us through our presentation today. So first, we are, of course, recording this for others to be able to view later on. So if you would, be sure just to keep your mics muted unless you're responding to a question. If you would, be sure that, of course, you have renamed yourself so that we know kind of who we're interacting with. And we do want today's session to be interactive. So again, feel free to locate that chat button, open up the chat box, introduce yourself, and ask questions throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring that. And I know Stacey's going to be posing some questions to you guys as we go through. So that'll be a way for you to respond if you aren't comfortable unmuting yourself to answer questions. We will be posting some of the resources from today's session on Padlet. And I'll share this link again and QR code with you at the end. So if you miss it now, don't worry, we'll share it again at the end. But this is a great way to come back and be able to find the recordings, as well as resources from some of the previous sessions we've done in this series in previous years. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Stacy Graham, who's going to talk to us a little bit about bias in primary sources.
Thank you, Kira. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen because I do have a short PowerPoint for you, and this PowerPoint should be available on the Padlet if you want to. If you want to download it, because it has a lot of links on it, and so that's kind of I put all the resources and links in the PowerPoint, so you just need to download the PowerPoint. Okay, so we wanted to explore the issue of how to navigate bias, because this is going to be something that your students will run into, whether they're working on a History Day project or not. So this is just a preliminary kind of discussion about it, including a graphic organizer and an example case study. So here we go. First off, I'm going to start off by asking the question, what is bias? And it's one of those that you know exactly what it is in your head, but it might be a little bit harder to articulate. So if you want to drop some stabs at a definition into the chat box, or mute yourself and go ahead and say them out loud, either one, I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Any kind of ideas coming up?
So opinion not supported by fact.
Yeah, that's good.
I was thinking opinion too, because I think that that's something students might be thinking about.
Okay, that's a good way to start thinking about it. I just stole the definition straight off Wikipedia. Of course, there are many places that you can get a definition for this. But I liked the way that Wikipedia kind of said it was a disproportionate weight either in favor or against something, usually in a way that's closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. So when the word disproportionate might not be a word that your students will come up with or even grasp very easily, but what that means is, again, the lack of evidence supporting this, right? And so there are lots of different kinds of biases when approaching primary sources in a history class. And the one that we're going to focus on today is the bias of the primary source itself. And of course, Your students are going to have their own bias. You're going to have your own bias. There's going to be all these different filters, but that's a question for another day. So I did want to say something about the bias against bias, because a lot of people think, oh, if a source is biased, that means I can't use it. And I'm here to tell you that good luck finding a source that does not have bias. So how can you use them, despite the fact that they are all biased? So I have this great quote from a Bruce Lesh book that I used to always use in my teaching historical thinking class. So I'm just going to read it off kind of quickly. So he's talking about his own classroom experience. He's saying, I intentionally do not use this word bias when discussing sources and poo-poo it when students use it in class discussion. My displeasure with the term is that students equate bias with either lying or ignorance, instead of accepting that historical sources inherently have a point of view. Students see bias as a pernicious disease that erodes a source's utility. In addition, their use of the term always has a negative connotation. In a historical context, bias is a neutral word because all sources have one. So I think that in a nutshell, what you can say from this is maybe a better way to think about bias when it comes to primary sources in history is perspective or point of view, or opinion, like some of you said. It's something that they're all going to have, and it's part of your job as an analytical historian in training to ferret out what that is, and then to factor it into your interpretation. So I have kind of boiled it down to a process of 3 questions. Now, I did make a graphic organizer for this presentation, which uses these 3 questions. And I'm going to give you the link so that you can download it. But this is also a work in progress. So if you have any suggestions for how I can tweak these questions or how I can tweak the organizer, let me know and we can fix it. And then when it gets into a really good, when we feel like it's a good draft, we can then post it permanently on the graphic organizer page of our website. So the 3 questions that I thought were a really good way to approach this overarching question of bias in primary sources is, all right, identify what is the bias here. And then, okay, well, how can we explain the presence of this bias? So if it's somebody who's writing very favorably about a particular political party, then we know a little bit about their background to say, okay, well, they've been a 20-year supporter of this political party, or they're running for office soon, or, they're a businessman with this kind of vested interest in a law that's about to be passed. What is the context here that explains this bias? And then, okay, all that in mind, how can we use it to actually make the source useful in our interpretation? So in other words, not throwing away the source because they found bias in it, but how do you use the source once you've kind of done those questions on it? And here's the graphic organizer, very, very simple, just those 3 questions, but the first line is what is the primary source that you're looking at right now? And so this particular graphic organizer has 3 columns. If we have time today, we're actually going to look at 4 primary sources, but I like to make sure that there's room for people to write in there. So if you're using this in the classroom, it might be better to do a exercise that has 3 of them. And if we run out of time, we may only look at 3 primary sources today. Okay, so I was trying to think about, okay, what would be a good example? And Kira and I were thinking about that time period from the Gilded Age to the very early Progressive era, because we hear from teachers a lot that students have a hard time connecting to that era. So I like that era. I think it's really interesting, but I remember what it was like to not know anything about it and not think it was interesting. So I focused in on standard number US 11 from the high school US History and Geography curriculum. And it's explain the rise of the labor movement, union tactics, the role of leaders, the unjust use of prison labor, and the responses of management and government. And I do want to give a little plug right now to two separate activities that we have on our TPS website. They're both in the close reading exercises tab. One of them focuses on two speeches by Eugene Debs in his when he was protesting World War I, and then he was tried for sedition. And then there's another one, which is a letter by a union leader who's affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, written to Samuel Gompers, who of course was the founder of the AFL. And those are both from the second decade of the 20th century. And like I said, those are from our close reading exercises. So I didn't want to focus on that part of the standard for this. We're going to look at union tactics. And oh no, sorry, my underlines do not match where they should go on here, because I think I must have lowered the text box unintentionally. We're going to look at the Coal Creek Labor Saga there. So the Coal Creek Labor Saga, some of you might already be very familiar with it. Some of you might have had to teach it several times. But in case some of you don't know about it, or don't know as much about it, or may have forgotten about it because you're now teaching something else, a quick run over of the Coal Creek Labor Saga. This is when, the state ran up a lot of debts during the Civil War and was in really need to kind of fill the state coffers after the Civil War. And they decided to use prisoners from the state penitentiaries as labor to help pay back state debt. And at this time, also, a lot of African-American men were being arrested on, shall we say, overblown charges, and the percentage of African Americans in Tennessee prisons from like 1865 to like 1870 was an incredible increase of like a couple 100% or something like that. And so using convict labor can be seen as a way of kind of a replacement for enslaved labor. But it also is a response to a lot of free labor starting to unionize at this time. And companies don't want free mine workers to unionize, because then they want to, the people who work in the coal mines in places like Anderson County and Grundy County, which are the two counties that are largely involved in this saga, they wanted a lot of things, but two things above all else. One, they wanted to get paid in cash so that they weren't paid in company scrip, which meant they could only buy at the company store at inflated prices, and they couldn't, just get a good return on their actual wages. The second thing is to use their own, what are called check weighmen, the people who weigh the coal that they dug that comes in, and reports, because however much you dig and load, that equates to how much you get paid. But if you have someone who's not really, shall we say, fair or objective when it comes to the actual numbers of weighing the tonnage, then you can get ripped off. And Tennessee state law allowed for both of these things, but the law was not enforced. And so these companies got away with continuing these practices to the disadvantage of free laborers. And so when you bring convict laborers that can undercut the wages of any free laborer, then you're going to get a lot of tension breaking out. And so this is exactly what happens. We're going to focus on Anderson County. There's 3 towns in a row: Briceville, Freighterville, and then Coal Creek, which is now called Rocky Top. And in between was called Lake City once the lake actually was created, but that was after TBA. So that might be a little bit confusing. But that little area of Anderson County, which is really close to Norris Dam State Park now, this is where a lot of the action happened. And this was a huge deal at the time. Like, this was nationwide news. This is 1891, 1892, 1893. And it didn't reflect well on anybody. The governor didn't do what the workers wanted. The workers started off with people on their sides, but then kind of lost that moral support. But in the end, the state did, as a result of this, discontinue the leases, the contracts, so that it kind of petered out in the later 1890s. But instead of doing that, the state found another way to use the convict laborers directly and just built Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary so that they didn't have to work with coal companies themselves. They were their own coal company, and they used forced prison labor until 1937 at Brushy Mountain. So it's a tale that brings in a lot of really great historic sites that are still there that you can go see on the ground if you're in those areas. Okay, that was my summary. Sorry if that took too long. There is a really good summary that is available on the Tennessee Encyclopedia. The last slide in this PowerPoint has a list of resources, and one of those links will get you to that short encyclopedia article where you can get a more detailed rundown than what I just gave you. So I have 4 different primary sources here. And where it says download PDF here, if you click on that, in fact, I am actually going to, okay, I am going to show you really quickly what it looks like when, what that looks like. Because here we go. I put the full newspaper articles that I had selected on these sheets. So they're 1 page each, but you can see that this is more text than what you're going to see on the PowerPoint slides to come. So you can excerpt these as much as you want. I just wanted you to have kind of more text to play around with. And then we have a political cartoon that appears alongside a different article in a newspaper. So it's an illustration. And then we have a photograph. So we're going to take a closer look at these now, starting with the first one. So I am just going to read through this, and I'm going to ask these questions, keeping in mind those 3 analysis questions that are on the graphic organizer. What is the bias? How do we account for that bias? And then how do we use this? And that 3rd question might be something that we come back around once we've looked at all of them and be like, okay, how can we use them all together? So first off, this is, and I wish I could read the bottom of the screen, but it's now being covered by my bar. But it is from 1891. This is what happened was the free miners attacked the stockade where the convict workers were kept, and put them on a train to Knoxville and asked the governor for a parley. And the governor was supposed to be this big supporter of workers' rights, but he ended up not being as supportive as they had hoped. And then the next year, they attacked the stockade again and just set all the convicts free. But this is a little bit earlier on. So shall we then abolish convict labor? No, for he must live, he being the convict, and living must eat, and he must be fed. If he works, he creates something instead of the food he destroys. If he does not work, the tax list of the state is poorer for every morsel he consumes. If he were free, he would labor and compete with other labor, but he would have the burdens on his shoulders also that other labor carries. He must provide not only food and clothes for himself, but those who are dependent on him, and he must lay by for the days of illness and age when he cannot work. You know, you have to provide their own retirement. The convict supports no family, lays nothing by. His day's work needs only to buy his food and clothing for the one day. The free man is handicapped by his freedom in such a competition. But the convict must work, or the free man be taxed to support him in idleness. And I do have another paragraph that's really good, but in this, for the purposes of time, I'm going to just leave that off. So what kind of bias, if any, do you detect in this source?
So Stacey, while folks are having a moment to kind of put their thoughts in the text box, if you want to switch back to your shared screen so we can see the text for that
Oh my
slide.
goodness, I'm so sorry. Why didn't you tell me before?
Sorry,
Forgive
I put it in
me,
the text
it's
box,
been
but
a while.
that was slide 9. So everyone, and we've got the link to the PowerPoint. Yeah, so there we go.
This is why I try not to bounce back and forth too much. Okay.
So I think this is a really good piece for thinking about bias because, again, in the first 2 sentences, it is clear what his agenda is, right? It's making a clear argument.
So if you were going to break it down for students, you could put them into categories like, okay, so we've got a lot of different interested parties here. We have free miners, we have convict miners, we have the people who own the mining companies, and then we have like the governor who sends out the state militia and the state kind of authorities. So who would this be sympathetic to or not sympathetic to?
Yeah, so someone mentioned in the text box, of course, that it's sympathetic to the convict labor, but posing this question that, the convicts must work or the free man be taxed. So it's setting up this, well, which would you rather have,
Yeah.
dichotomy.
Right. And there were a lot fewer sources that actually mentioned what the convicts might be going through at all, because most of the time what they want is ignored because it's assumed, well, they don't have a right to have a say in this because they're convicts, right? Even though they might have just stolen a loaf of bread or something ridiculous or something like that. So yeah, this is actually sympathetic to the convicts. And it's not unsympathetic to the free laborers either, but it is, so it's not going to be taking the side of the moneyed powers just yet. So why might this particular newspaper be sympathetic? And in order to move my bar. In order to do that, I'm going to show you one thing that you can do when you are working within Chronicling America. And I am going to stop share so that I can switch to the website. Okay, and oh man, this bar is killing me. Okay, so when you are looking at newspapers, these are all from the Library of Congress's Chronicling America. There is a line underneath the title, and it says about, and this is a newspaper from Kansas. And so if you click on that, it'll take you to an informational Library of Congress, an informational page, which will give you what you need to know. Are you kidding me? Sorry, y'all.
So I will say that's a new one on me. I've not seen that screen before.
No, usually it's Chumley fixing a tire.
Yes.
This is the first time I've seen a boat. Oh, or a ship, I suppose. Okay. Anyway, so the thing is that it will have a little history of the newspaper itself in a right-hand column, and it'll tell you about the political leanings of the paper, which is something your students might not realize because they think, oh, it's the news. It should try to be as objective as possible, right? But that wasn't necessarily the mission for newspapers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were very political weapons or instruments, I guess I should say. So it's always good to look at what are the political leanings of the newspaper. But if you just look at the name of the newspaper, People's Voice. Wait a sec. Yeah. So, okay. People's Voice sounds very populist to me, which would imply that they are not on the side of the government or the corporations. Okay. So now I'm going to go back. Excuse me. I'm having. This is why I shouldn't bounce back and forth. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay. This is, we're on the same page, literally. So I do have another excerpt that's supposed to go with this, but we're not going to look at that for the sake of time. We're going to look at the next newspaper excerpt. And this one is from Bolivar, Tennessee. Also, this is the end of July 1891. So this is July is the month in which the miners first started taking kind of violent action. It wasn't as violent as the beginning. They, put the convicts on train cars and sent them to Knoxville. Then the governor sent them back. And it isn't until the next year that the state militia actually builds a fort overlooking the town of Coal Creek and puts a Gatling gun at the top of that mountain to kind of make sure that the miners don't, get out of hand. So, okay. Knoxville, Tennessee, July 26th. So this is a dispatch. The war is over. Of course, little did they know it's not. But the miners have unconditionally surrendered. Governor Buchanan has won a great victory and without bloodshed. This satisfactory result was reached last evening a little before 6 o'clock. When day came yesterday morning, it was very generally believed that troops would move to Coal Creek at an early hour, but the day wore along and no troops moved. Up to noon, citizens believed they would go. And even at noon, many persons were heard on the street saying the troops would go in the afternoon, but they did not go. Soon became known, however, that the troops would not be ordered to move. They were ready to go to Mom's house. All right. I think we all know they were ready to go. Let's see. Okay. I'm just going to go into when they did not go, citizens became nervous and matters seemed to be in a very bad condition. And there were rumors upon rumors that the governor would surrender to a mob of lawless men. It was learned that the sheriff of Anderson County would not act and ask for a posse. It was said the governor was powerless, but the result has shown that Governor Buchanan knew what he was about. I'm going to stop it right there. So what is the bias, or what are the biases that we see in this newspaper article?
So I always start by looking for like what adjectives and adverbs are being used. That seems to be a great way to figure out again where the bias is. And one of the first ones that really jumped out at me is the lawless men.
Mob of lawless men. So who is he talking about when he says mob of lawless men? Who are those men?
So that's the miners, right?
The free miners. These are the free miners. They're not even talking about the convicts. So they're like saying the governor shouldn't give in to the demands of the free miners in Anderson County.
So it's mentioned here in the chat, of course, that this is a pro-government, kind of pro-corporation take on
yes, it is. This is actually pretty sympathetic to Governor Buchanan. And that's very important because remember, Buchanan came into office with the support of a lot of free laborers thinking that he was on their side. He was a Democrat. And this is in Bolivar. Of course, Bolivar is in West Tennessee. So they're kind of removed from this. And it's just a Democratic leaning paper. So it makes sense that they're on the governor's side. But the governor is actually getting kudos for not giving in to these poor free laborers and their demands. And so this is an example of how not everybody was sympathetic with the workers here. All right, so let's look at a non-text-based primary source. This is I'm sorry. I don't know why the link was wrong 2 slides ago. This is the one for the People's Voice in Kansas. I'll have to fix that later. So this is on the front page of a newspaper that is covered with, it has a lot of really good articles as well. This is linked from an old newsletter lesson idea that one of our former graduate students did on this topic. So it's also linked from a Library of Congress blog about this topic, and those you can find in the resources. So looking at this, and if you can't read what's in the circles, I would show you how you can zoom in, but I'm just going to tell you because I don't want to bounce back and forth. So up here, it says the National Guards used to uphold the majesty of the corporation. Used, as in utilized, not used to. And then Coal Creek over here on the top right, a battle for bread. Down at the bottom left, the convict slaves still at work. This is not Russia, it is free Colombia. Colombia being a metaphor for America. And remember, Russia is only a couple decades away from its own revolution at this point. The miner's home, no work, no bread. We can't compete with convicts and live. And we have Platt over here. Platt was representative of the company being the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, called TCI. They were the ones who were owned the mines and were paying the state of Tennessee to use convict labor. So they were profiting off of this very much, as was the state of Tennessee. And then Bryce, a Democrat over here. And then here we have the convict laborer in between in his stripes. And of course, he referred to as zebra stripes. So they were very easy to pick out. But it's a little misleading because, like I said, most of the convicts were actually Black. But some of them were white. So I guess to be more sympathetic, or to get more sympathy, they're depicting a white one. So an unholy alliance, the cause and its effects. What are the biases that you see here?
So it was noted right off the use of that word majesty, the majesty of the corporation. That is a very strong phrase.
Right. The National Guards used to uphold the majesty of the corporation. So that kind of makes the corporation sound like I consider that to be a tongue-in-cheek use of the word majesty, personally, because the newspaper is criticizing that the corporation is using National Guards. So the corporation has this uppity image of itself, and they're using National Guards to do their dirty work. And it's actually kind of funny too, because the state had to use and employ state militiamen to take care of this 3 years long conflict. The state actually spent a lot of money on that. And so it didn't end up saving or making the money that it was hoping, because it had to pay money for damage control. So let that be a lesson, I guess. But yeah, majesty is a very strong word, and you want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So someone else notes that it's anti-convict labor.
Anti-convict labor, even though you have this, this is a fairly, for a political cartoon, this is a fairly, I guess you'd say, respectful drawing of a proud looking convict. But yeah, the fact that he's allied with these people and they call it unholy, those are all clues to the bias here.
So someone else asked, is there's any way to read what that bottom line of text is underneath where it says an unholy alliance?
Yes, I cut that out for time's sake. It's actually a very long paragraph, and that is included in the PDF. And you can also see what it says from, okay, I'll do it. I'll show you what it says. Okay, so I'm clicking on that link, stop share. I'm gonna go to that page. I just have to make sure to get back to my PowerPoint. So you can see here, woo, excuse me, my touchpad is a little bit more sensitive than my mouse. Okay, so you can, this is what it says beneath that. The patriotic rebels who at Bunker Hill laid down their lives that the Republic might live have ever been enshrined in the grateful hearts of a free people. So they're recalling revolutionary days here. The Tennessee miners have bled and died in defense of human rights. Future historians, us, will ascribe them a bright page in the annals of liberty. That's, if your students can't tell what the bias is after that, then yeah, they need to wake up a little bit, maybe to have some coffee. So biased against the convicts and for the free workers. Those free workers who, you know, look at their poor, starving children who just want some bread. And then it is also sympathetic in this little vignette to the convicts, because it's like they're calling them slaves. And that's a very strong word, because we're only within a generation of the Civil War here. And we're saying this is not Russia. So in other words, this is un-American. Yeah, and a battle for bread, again, that idea that this isn't just about money, this is about livelihoods and supporting families here. And you can see the miners firing at the stockade. And yes, there were casualties as a result of this war. A few deaths, maybe a dozen or so, not a whole lot, but it was just a lot of different skirmishes over a long span of time. Okay, so does that help seeing what it says underneath here? It's kind of more talking the words of liberty, human rights. Excuse me. I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint. Did that work?
Yes. You know, and I think with that, you know, political cartoon, it'd be interesting to like show pieces of that to students, and then, you know, kind of if you wanted to incorporate the text too, like at each layer, get them to think about again what is the message, what is the bias there.
And this would be a good one to do in a puzzle, where you take a political cartoon and you cut it into pieces, and then have them, so have like a student look at just the oval in the top right hand corner maybe, and then get together in a group and piece it together, and then like, oh, okay, oh, because then once they see what the other things say, then it confirms what they thought about the biases present, and then the language itself, you add more of the text to it. Okay, so this is definitely pro-worker, people's voice, pro-worker. So
another thing as you move forward, it was noted also in the chat that it's interesting that with multiple sources here, it's mentioned just the basic cost of like food and, you know, the basic necessities of life, that is factored into the arguments here.
Yes, yes, and I think and that's a clear tactic, because, you know, corporations then and now think in terms of large sums of money, and as does the state. You know, how much are we paying in order to house these prisoners? How much are we getting if we lease them for labor? So they think in the aggregate, you know, they think of these large terms, and companies think in terms of profits and losses, but the workers think in terms of daily wages. And that translates directly to what it takes to live on, because this is a very poor part of Tennessee. Even though it was booming in terms of the coal industry, it was still very poor for your average worker at that time. You had, it was ravaged by the Civil War, like a lot of other places in Tennessee. And you also had a lot of new immigrants. There was quite a contingent of Welsh immigrants in the Briceville area. Wales, of course, being a country that's very familiar with mining issues. And in fact, when I was driving through Briceville in March to go to Norris Dam, I drove by the church there that had been used by the miners as a kind of a holding pen for some of their prisoners for a little while. It's still there. It's very beautiful, and you can see it in Google Maps. Sorry. There I am, connecting place. All right, and then the last thing is from a slightly later time period. I like to find primary sources that are all kind of around the same time period, but this one comes later. But I think it's really good in terms of trying to look at bias in a photograph, because students are very visual. They're bombarded with images all the time. They take pictures all the time. And even though they know how easy it is to manipulate pictures these days, they still kind of take these kinds of sources at face value. And so I wanted to include this so that they could think about bias when it comes to a photograph, because they might think a photograph has no bias. Remember, everything has bias. Your job is to figure out what it is. So I'm going to show you the title of this in a second. But first, I want to see if anyone has any thoughts already, just looking at the image.
As people are considering that, someone noted, that a lot of these questions are questions that are really going to challenge students to think on their own. They're not things that you can easily kind of Google and get a quick answer to. And so that, this is where thinking about bias and analyzing, primary sources is a great way to challenge students.
Yes, whether they like it or not, right?
Yes. You must think.
All right, you ready for the title? It's a long one.
Yeah. So as you're pulling that up,
sorry.
someone also noted that, with photographs, it's, thinking about who is holding the camera and what their motivation is and how they frame a picture.
Right. So this is where you need to know who took the picture and what for. And that explains a lot. So hard work and dangerous for such a young boy. James Odell, a greaser and coupler on the tipple of the Cross Mountain Mine, Knoxville Iron Company in the vicinity of Coal Creek, Tennessee. So this is the exact same area that we're talking about, but this is in 1910. So this is almost 20 years later. James has been there 4 months, helps push these heavily loaded cars, appears to be about 12 or 13 years old. And the creator of this is Lewis Wick Hine, and this is part of the National Child Labor Committee collection at the Library of Congress. And he was a progressive reformer who took these pictures in order to lobby against child labor on a national scale. So his captions are just fantastic, because sometimes he's really kind of pushing you to interpret the image in a particular way. So what is the bias here?
So the thing that jumps out to me every time I see this picture is, again, the figure on the left, just how small he is. and how even the figure on the right, even though he's taller, he's still, he's very skinny. Like you can tell he's again just, he was not an adult, not someone who was like filled out. So again, they're just very slight, which makes you think about again the labor that they would be doing and how hard that would be. And so again, these young boys doing hard manual labor in dangerous conditions, and is that really what you want your own sons to be doing?
Yeah. So, and it really makes you wonder how conditions at the mine improved after the convict labor was done away with and only free miners were employed, but then the population was still so desperate to increase family income that they had to send their kids to work in these conditions. So this is a very much on the side of, this is bad. Knoxville Iron Company, this is bad. You shouldn't do this. So it's very much biased against child labor, which sounds really obvious when I say that. We all know that, but your students might have to be hit over the head with that. And again, if they, this is a great way to get them to start seeing obvious things, because once they know to look for obvious clues, then it becomes second nature to them. Okay, so looking at all those together, I did throw in one last thing, and this is the state historic marker that you drive by when you're going down the highway. I think it's, what is it, number 42 or something like that, up through Bryceville and Freighterville. And of course, Freighterville is the site of a terrible mine explosion, like a decade later, that trapped some miners in the shaft, and they died from suffocation, but not before they wrote letters to their loved ones that were then published in the newspapers. Real tearjerkers. It is just, the stories from this region are horrendous, the conditions that these people had to work in. So it might be kind of hard for your students to sympathize with the state side or the corporation side. But then you have to think, well, what would their interests have been? And how would, they're responsible for handling things on a larger level. And so how can they think about, individuals or something? But you can ask your students, I'm not going to do it because we don't have time, is there bias on the historical marker text? Because again, like I said, everything carries some sort of bias. Although we as modern historians like to think that we reduce ours as much as possible, so that we're not overwhelming the interpretation of a reader, but we still can't avoid it entirely. So this one's okay. So going through, I wanted to use those newspaper sources just so students know to look for bias in any kind of source. Even things that they thought were objective, even things like photographs that they think can't show a bias because it's just a snapshot of the way something is. That is not true. Photos can be staged in a certain way, and the captions of the pictures can be very biased for something or another. But then, these are the sources that we have to deal with. So how do we use them and bring them together to talk about, okay, what happened? What were people experiencing on the ground? How was the story shifting? How were sympathies shifting as these events unfolded over the course of 3 years? And so I am just going to wrap up by showing you that there are a lot of related resources, and they're on this slide. There's a blog article at the Library of Congress. We did a newsletter lesson about this back in 2014. The article from the encyclopedia plus the one about the governor. There is a lesson plan from Tennessee State Library and Archives, which has links to National History Day projects on this topic, which were very good. There's also a story about it at the Tennessee State Museum's site. And then the Coal Creek Miners Museum of Rocky Top, which of course is what Coal Creek was. their website there. So I'm going to turn this back over to Kira so she can give you your end links.
So a couple things, because we still have a few minutes left, and I know that Stacy's been sharing with us these different sources. One thing that I want to mention, I think that will be very beneficial to you and possibly to your students as they're doing research for History Day projects this year, is the library is in the process of migrating over the newspaper collections. So, if you're doing a History Day project, I encourage your students to think about how they can use historic newspapers. And the Library of Congress's Chronicling America collection is a fantastic one to make use of. It doesn't require any paid subscription, which unfortunately newspaper.com does. So that is sometimes a challenge for students if they can't access that one. But Chronicling America is open and available. But a couple things that I want to show you just briefly before we wrap up about how that is changing. In the past, we always talked about the way to access Chronicling America was coming from the Library of Congress from their digital collections and actually going to this page and accessing it this way. And you can still do this as of right now. I'm not sure when this will change, but you can still access it this way. Of course, doing the advanced search feature where you can narrow things down by state or by paper, all of those kind of ways that you can search through the newspaper collections. But what they have started doing that we were excited to find this summer is that you can now search from the homepage. Let's see what comes up. And you can use quotation marks to help try to kind of limit what will come up. Oh, no, that didn't work.
You just kind of have to put Cold Creek in because
Okay.
they call it, wars, insurrection. They call it a lot of different things. Oh, that's maybe.
It's all right. So this is what happens. Like sometimes again, when you put something in there, then you can do narrow it down on that left-hand sidebar. So we're looking at just newspapers. And you can see that all of a sudden, again, that we're getting a lot of results. And again, this is because it is now searching Chronicling America when you do a general homepage search, which is really exciting because used to that was not something that searched from the homepage. So the trick then is to, again, think about dates. This is where it's really important that your students do a little pre-work before they start searching in digital collections. And I know that Nikki has mentioned that she was going to create a graphic organizer to help students kind of think about kind of keywords, key dates, and those kind of things before they started searching through things. So again, you might want to have them think about narrowing things down by date. So again, if we're looking for primary sources for this event, we want to start by, again, getting closer. So we're going to look in 1850 to 1899. And let's see, remind me, what was the year on that? Okay. And then all of a sudden, again, now we're down to something that's much more manageable than what we started. So what we want to do, let me go back. So you want to hit where it says matches one page, because I have to remember how to do this. Because again, like this is a new trick to this. You're just being slow. All right. All right, so it's going to pull up that page, and again, we're still going to be able to get to where we are seeing where it's highlighting our search terms in red, which again is what you want, so that this is going to be easier for you and or your students to quickly kind of look at this and see if this is something that is going to be beneficial to what you're doing. So right here, this article, the call to arms. Tennesseans aroused to the necessity of prompt action for the suppression of lawlessness in the mining regions, troops, sheriff's posse hurrying to the seat of war. So again, we know that that's about what's going on, and we could scan this to see if this is something that we might want to use. Now, if it is, the other cool trick that I want to show you guys, again, that is new and different if you were searching from the homepage. Before you would have to kind of scroll in, kind of chop and then like cut and paste things back together. Well, now in these new pages, you can click on these scissors and you can actually draw on the page. And what you see, you hit click image, and it's going to pull that up in a new window, and you're actually going to see that part that you just highlighted, which again makes this a little easier, a little more user friendly than the previous version of how to search for this. So again, this is a great update, one that they are continuing to work on. So again, be patient, but know that this is something that is changed. And as Stacy mentioned, let me see if we can figure out how to get to where we could actually read. Let's see, about this newspaper. Yeah. So we want to get to where we can, again, read a little bit about the background. So again, who owned this paper? What was their editorial bias? And so again, if you get to that, you can read this little article, and it's going to give you a lot of insight into who owned the paper. Again, what was their editorial slant? Did that change over time? You can get a lot of information from that. So again, you want to look for that about this newspaper piece. All right, any questions? Maybe questions that you guys have about finding primary sources or using the Library of Congress website. We wanted to leave a little bit of time here at the end to give you a chance to ask those kind of questions to us. So Stacy and I have been doing this job for a long time. And so if there's a trick to finding something on the site, probably one of us has done it before.
Well, people are thinking, I wanted to jump off of something Chris shared about working in media and staging of photos. A great activity you can do with kids prior to digging into exploring primary sources. And as Ryan mentioned, the perspective of who is creating that image, like the photographer, who paid for the photographer, why are they there, is looking at advertisements for places like McDonald's, and then looking at the products that are actually in the image, because it's not food, right? So getting kids to compare the two and then talking about the perspectives there, right? Like, okay, does this look like an actual meal looks like, and kind of digging into that advertisement and why does it look that way? What is this evoking in us? Why did they choose those colors? And then applying those same questions to whatever primary sources you're looking at, especially images.
So one of my other favorites, I am a huge fan of these bird's eye view maps. They're from the late 1800s. And you look at them at first, you're thinking again, this is, what kind of bias does this have? But if you get to looking at these, all of these are created. Let's see where it's usually somewhere on here. It will talk about that it is created basically by like a real estate company. These are all about promoting development of these cities. And so if you start to think about, well, who was creating them, and then you look at them again, it's like, well, oh, obviously, because in each one of these, the thing that points out is you have all this like open land. Like, look at all this space that you can come and move to and create opportunity for yourself near this economic center with this fantastic river to help like move your products. And every one of them basically is designed in the same way. And so again, this is where even maps like these have a bias. And so again, it's just another great tool. So one other thing that I'll point out before we get ready to close, but again, if anyone has a question, feel free to drop those in the chat box. Be sure also to check out, we have a number of different analysis worksheets and graphic organizers that our TPS program has created over the years that can be really beneficial to kind of, again, working in some of these skills. So Stacy has that one that she is kind of piloting and working on. But a couple of others that kind of take this into consideration, although it's not specifically just on bias, but thinking about the ones that focus on historical thinking skills. So, for example, the HIPPO worksheet that we have, where we're asking students to analyze a source, thinking about its historical context, its intended audience, its point of view, its purpose, and then what outside information that it brings in. And then the HAPPY addresses a lot of the same questions. So historical context, audience, point of view, purpose. And then for this one, the difference is instead of the O, the Y is significance. Why is this source important? And so again, kind of getting at some similar questions, but kind of a different way of thinking about it. So definitely you can find these, we can analyze it that way. Another different way to think about analyzing a source is thinking about it from an economic, social, and political perspective. And this works really well, especially with political cartoons. And so that's another way that you can kind of think about having students analyze a source and, think about a kind of a different series of questions. But as you can see here on our tools page, and we'll drop the link for this in a Padlet as well, there are just, quite a few different analysis guides that we have created over the years that might be beneficial to you as you're getting either in your classes in general or helping students to kind of think about how to analyze their sources as they're building out their History Day projects. So definitely take a look at those. And then also, be sure, again, the close reading exercises that we mentioned earlier are there. Theme guides, these are going to be great if you have students who are, trying to get started, still thinking kind of, broad picture, but these are great kind of bibliography pieces. Primary source sets are places where we have done kind of curated searches for different sources. These also can be beneficial when working on a History Day project. So if we didn't have any questions, then we will go ahead and move towards closing out here.
So I just put 2 links in the chat. The first one is to the second one is to this Padlet where all of the resources from today and a recording will go. So if you need to refer back to it or if you want to share it with somebody, it lives there. And then the first link is to the Google form that you will fill out so I can generate your PD certificate for today. You will receive a separate PD certificate for tomorrow. So you'll need to do 2 of those. They're super brief. And then tomorrow you will also receive a quick form for your stipend. And this is so I know where to mail it to. Because sometimes mail doesn't get to you at school. So this gives just a good address for me to get that to you. So in total, you will receive 3 short Google Forms to make sure we get everything covered for this series. If you have any questions or issues with these links, email me or Kiera. My email is historyday@tennesseehistory.org. And yeah, that's it from me.
So as Nikki says, she's dropped those links in the chat box. If anyone has any questions about that, let us know. And keep in mind as you're moving forward, that Stacy and I are here and happy to assist you guys as you're looking for sources. And if your students are struggling with using the Library of Congress website, we are happy to kind of help point them in the right direction. So feel free to drop us an email, and we are happy to, again, answer your questions and point them in the right direction. So thank you guys again for your time. We'll stick around here for just a second. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to hang on after we end the recording. And we look forward to seeing you guys again tomorrow.